What would you do if your own child was struck? Not in the chaos of a street corner, but in the seat he rightfully earned. Imagine sending your son on a flight, confident he'd be safe, only to receive a message that a flight attendant slapped him simply because she believed he didn't belong in first class. In that moment, what choice would you make? Would you stay silent, swallow the humiliation, hope it faded with time, or would you stand up, not only for your child but for every silent witness who has ever been told they don't deserve a place at the table? Now, picture it's not just a stranger's story. Picture it's you, your son, your daughter. What would you demand of the world? What would you demand of justice? This is not only a story about one boy, one slap, or one airline. It's about dignity, silence, and the courage to turn pain into change. Stay with us, because once you hear what happened after that single phone call, you'll never step onto a plane the same way again. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so together we can keep voices like this alive. The sliding doors of the Aerovista jet whispered open, letting in the faint hum of the terminal. A boy of 15 stepped inside, his movements measured, almost too composed for his age. His name was Isaiah Brooks. He clutched nothing more than a worn leather backpack and a book whose spine was creased from use. He wore a blazer, navy blue, a size too big for his frame. The sleeves brushed his wrists, and the collar sat a little loose, yet he carried himself as if he belonged exactly where he was headed toward seat 2A in the front row of first class. But belonging, on this flight, was not something everyone was willing to grant him. A couple seated in row 1 exchanged glances. The man raised an eyebrow, the woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Behind them, a businessman with the silver hair adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze sharp, assessing. There was no whisper of welcome in their eyes. Instead, there was a single unspoken question. What is he doing here? Isaiah noticed, though he didn't flinch. He lowered his eyes back to the book in his hand, a collection of Baldwin essays he'd borrowed from his father's shelf. He didn't read just yet. He simply held it like a shield. From the aisle came the measured steps of Claire Hensley, the lead flight attendant. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, her hair pinned so tightly it might as well have been lacquered in place. She had worked in the skies for nearly 2 decades. She prided herself on discipline, on order, on keeping things proper. But her sense of proper had borders Isaiah had just crossed. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice carrying a sharp edge beneath the polite veneer. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Isaiah looked up, calm, and offered the slip of paper without hesitation. Claire's eyes scanned the printed details, then lifted back to his face. Her brows knit together, faintly incredulous. "Seat 2A," she repeated. "Yes." Isaiah answered softly. His voice carried no challenge, no defensiveness, just fact. Claire paused. The businessman in row 1 leaned ever so slightly forward, listening. A ripple of silence spread across the cabin, the kind that seems to stretch even the ticking of a wristwatch. "Well," Claire said at last, "that's unusual." She handed the pass back, her nails tapping against the cardboard like punctuation. "Enjoy your flight." But her smile never reached her eyes. Isaiah slid into 2A. The leather seat was cool against his back, the armrest firm beneath his hand. He placed the book on his lap and let out a breath. On the other side of the aisle, a woman angled her phone away, as if guarding it from him. The man beside her cleared his throat in quiet disapproval. Isaiah opened his book. He read the first line once, twice, but the words refused to sink in. He could feel the stares pressing down on him like a second atmosphere. He closed the book, rested his hand on the cover, waited. Claire returned 10 minutes later for the pre-flight check. Her heels clicked against the cabin floor with a rhythm of authority. She stopped at 2A again. "Sir," she began, tilting her head, "are you sure this is your seat?" Isaiah blinked. "Yes, I am." Her eyes narrowed, not in suspicion of a mix-up, but in judgment. In her mind, the image did not match the assignment. A boy, barely a teenager, a black boy at that. Alone in first class, it disrupted the picture she believed should exist here. "May I ask where your parents are traveling today?" she pressed. Isaiah's voice was steady, but a faint weariness edged his tone. "I'm traveling by myself." Another silence spread, thicker this time. The businessman in row 1 chuckled under his breath. Someone muttered. Figures. Claire felt the heat rise in her chest, a concoction of authority and bias. She had seen children in first class before, but always the kind who matched her unspoken template pale skin, expensive shoes, names she recognized from society pages. Isaiah Brooks carried none of those markers. "You'll forgive me," she said, her smile tightening, "but this just doesn't look right." Her words fell like frost in the cabin air. Isaiah's hand tightened on his book. He looked at her fully now, his gaze unwavering. He did not argue, did not plead. He simply met her eyes as if to say, "This is my place, whether you like it or not." Claire felt the challenge in that silence, though no word had been spoken. And something inside her bristle as the last of the passengers boarded. The door sealed shut with a hollow thud. The engines hummed alive beneath the wings. Yet in row 2A, a storm was already forming, invisible but inevitable. Isaiah leaned back, finally opening his book again, but even as his eyes scanned the page, his ears tracked every whisper, every shifting glance, every note of doubt circling like vultures overhead. He told himself he could endure it. After all, he'd endured worse. He was Nathaniel Brooks' son, and Nathaniel had taught him that silence could be stronger than shouting, that dignity could outlast disdain. But Isaiah also knew something else. Sometimes silence was mistaken for weakness, and sometimes silence was the very stage upon which cruelty performed its act. He turned the page, waited. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff. The story of Flight 672 had only just begun. The plane was still taxiing when Claire returned to the aisle. She had made her routine checks, her announcements delivered with crisp efficiency. But something in her chest hadn't settled. She kept glancing back at seat 2A, as though the boy sitting there was an error waiting to be corrected. Isaiah sat quietly, his book open once more. The hum of the engines masked the faint tremor in his fingers as he turned a page. He could feel her shadow before she spoke, the way light dimmed when someone hovered too close. "Sir," Claire said again, soft but pointed. "Can I ask to see your pass one more time?" Isaiah lifted his eyes, calm, patient. He handed it over without a word. Claire studied it, tracing the letters with her eyes as if the ink itself might rearrange into something different. Seat 2A, first class, Isaiah Brooks. There was no mistake. Yet her lips pressed thin as though there should have been one. The businessman in row 1 shifted in his seat. His cufflinks caught the light as he leaned toward his wife. "Unbelievable," he muttered, not quite quietly enough. The wife gave a faint nod, her eyes fixed on Isaiah with a blend of pity and reproach. Isaiah closed his book again. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was easier to pause than to keep reading words you could no longer see. The noise around him was louder than the roar of engines. Claire handed the pass back. Her tone clipped. "Thank you. I'll be speaking with my supervisor about this." Isaiah accepted it. "That's fine," he said softly. The words were simple, but his composure unsettled her more than defiance would have. She turned sharply, heels striking the floor with practiced force. But even as she moved on, her jaw clenched. Behind Isaiah, a middle-aged woman leaned across the aisle to whisper to her companion. "They let anyone in here these days," she said. Her voice wasn't cruel. Not exactly. It was casual, careless, the kind of prejudice that didn't even recognize itself as such. Isaiah heard. He always did. But he kept his gaze forward, fixed on the safety card in the pocket ahead of him. He traced the diagrams with his eyes, each line crisp and impersonal, as though humanity could be reduced to arrows and exits. For a moment, he wished it could. The engines grew louder. The cabin lights dimmed further. The world outside the window blurred into streaks of gray as the plane turned toward the runway. Claire returned once more, this time leaning close enough that Isaiah could smell the sharp tang of her perfume. "I'll ask you one more time," she said, voice tight. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Isaiah blinked slowly. "Yes, I'm sure." Her expression hardened. In her mind, his calm felt like provocation, like disrespect. She'd spent years commanding cabins, ensuring order, enforcing rules. She believed herself the guardian of what was appropriate. And this boy, this silence, this refusal to yield felt like a challenge she could not ignore. From across the aisle, the silver-haired businessman smirked. The tension had become entertainment now, a private spectacle for those who thought the boy didn't belong. Isaiah felt the weight of all their eyes, but he didn't move. He sat still, hands folded over his book. His father had always told him dignity is not in how loud you speak, but in how long you can hold your ground. Claire straightened. Her hand brushed against her hip, fingers twitching as though deciding something. Her lips parted, closed again. Then, with a sharp inhale, she stepped back. The engines roared as the plane accelerated down the runway. Isaiah closed his eyes, steadying his breath, steadying his heart. The world shook as the wheels lifted from the ground, gravity pressing him back against the seat. But the crack had already formed, and though the plane climbed higher into the clouds, the cabin itself felt like it was sinking into something heavy, unseen. At 30,000 feet, silence can be deafening. Isaiah opened his book again, not to read, but to hide behind the familiar cover. He knew the story wasn't finished. He knew the questions weren't over, and he knew that the dignity he clung to would soon be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. Far behind him, Claire stood in the galley, arms folded tight across her chest. She stared at the closed curtain that separated her from first class, her mind replaying every glance, every word, every silent defiance she thought she'd seen in the boy's eyes. Something inside her whispered that she had gone too far already. Another voice insisted she hadn't gone far enough. In the quiet between those voices, the crack widened. The flight had only just begun. The seatbelt sign had barely switched off when Claire returned, her steps quick and decisive, as though she had already made up her mind. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of conversations, the faint clink of glasses as attendants began their service. But over it all, there was a tension in the air, something unspoken, like a storm gathering just beyond the windows. Isaiah sat quietly, his book resting on his lap, gaze lowered. He wasn't reading, he was bracing. He had felt Claire's stare too many times already. He knew she was coming back. "Sir," Claire said, standing above him, her arms crossed in practiced authority, "I'm going to need you to move. This seat isn't for you." Isaiah looked up, calm. His voice was steady but tired. "This is my seat." Her jaw tightened. "I don't think so. Let me find you another place in economy." The businessman in row 1 smirked, pretending not to listen but savoring every word. A few passengers leaned slightly into the aisle, curious. The moment had become a kind of theater, and Isaiah was the unwilling lead. "No," Isaiah said softly, his hands still on his book. "This is my seat." Claire's breath came sharp through her nose. She leaned down, voice low but edged with steel. "Don't test me." Isaiah met her gaze. For a moment, the cabin was utterly still, the hum of the engines, the chatter, even the rattle of ice in glasses seemed to fade. There were only 2 people in that space, a boy who refused to move, and a woman who refused to accept that refusal. Then it happened. A sudden, swift motion. Her hand struck across his face, the sound cracking through the cabin like the snap of a flag in the wind. Gasps scattered through the rows. A fork clattered onto a tray. Somewhere in the back, a child whimpered, hushed quickly by a parent. Isaiah's head turned slightly from the force, but he did not cry out. He blinked, once, twice, and then lifted his hand to his cheek. His book slid from his lap and landed softly against the carpet. The silence that followed was suffocating. Not a soul spoke. The businessman looked away now, suddenly fascinated by the in-flight magazine. The woman in row 1 picked at her cuticle. Her lips pressed thin. People had seen, but no one moved, no one intervened. Claire straightened, her face flushed. "That's enough," she snapped, though her voice wavered. "You're going to the back. Now." Isaiah bent slowly, picked up his book, and stood. He did not speak. His eyes lingered on hers just long enough to carve the moment into memory. Then, with quiet steps, he followed her down the aisle. She led him past the rows, past the watching eyes that pretended to look elsewhere. He could feel the weight of their silence pressing against his back. In silence, people had chosen their side, at the very rear of the plane. She pointed to an empty seat by the lavatory. "Sit here," she ordered. Isaiah sank into the narrow economy seat. The leather worn, the armrests sticky from use. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. It was as far as one could get from 2A, not just in distance but in dignity. Claire stood for a moment, arms crossed again, as though securing her victory. Then she turned and walked briskly back toward first class, her heels striking a rhythm of finality. Isaiah sat still. His cheek stung where her hand had landed. His chest tightened, but not from fear. It was something heavier, something he had felt before, but never quite like this. He opened his phone, the screen casting a faint glow in the dim cabin light. 9 words. That was all he typed. "She slapped me. I'm in the back." He stared at the message for a moment before pressing send. He knew it would reach his father instantly, and he knew what that meant. In the galley. Claire poured herself a glass of water. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The slap had been impulsive, unplanned, but now it was done, and she told herself it was justified. Discipline, order, respect. That's what she believed she had defended. Yet, in the quiet corners of her mind, another voice whispered, "You went too far." She ignored it. In seat 34B, Isaiah closed his phone and tucked it back into his blazer pocket. He held his book again, though he didn't open it. He simply rested it against his lap like a tether to something familiar. His eyes stared at the seat back in front of him, blank and gray, and he waited. The engines roared softly beneath the floor. The plane cut smoothly through the sky. Passengers chatted again, sipped their wine, adjusted their screens. The cabin tried to return to normal. But normal had already broken. A crack had split wide open, and though most tried to pretend they hadn't heard it, Isaiah knew the sound would echo long after the flight was over. In an office tower overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Nathaniel Brooks sat at the head of a polished oak table. The room was filled with directors from his company, Brooks Global Systems, their laptops open, charts projected against a glass wall, numbers, contracts, projections. This was Nathaniel's world, the arena where he had built his empire brick by brick, deal by deal. His face was calm, his presence commanding, but his eyes always carried the kind of weight that comes from fighting too many battles no one else had seen. He was in the middle of listening to a quarterly report when his phone buzzed on the table, a single vibration. His assistant glanced toward him, expecting him to ignore it, as he usually did during meetings. But Nathaniel reached for the device, almost unconsciously. He never ignored messages from his son. The screen lit up. 9 words. "She slapped me. I'm in the back." Nathaniel read the words once, then again. His chest tightened, and the air in the boardroom seemed to thin. He sat perfectly still, but something in his posture shifted, enough that every executive at the table felt it. The voice presenting faltered. He didn't need details. He didn't need context. The simplicity of the message told him everything. Isaiah would never exaggerate, never dramatize. His boy's strength was silence, endurance. If Isaiah had chosen to send this, then it was truth. Nathaniel placed the phone down slowly. He stared at the city lights beyond the glass wall, his mind moving faster than the traffic below. He saw his son, 15, sitting quietly in a seat that should have been his, enduring humiliation he had not earned. He saw the back of a hand striking his boy's face. He saw the silence of strangers. For a fleeting second, Nathaniel's hands trembled beneath the table. He clenched them into fists, then relaxed. His expression remained carved in stone. But inside him rose an old fire, one he had spent decades taming. His mind flashed to his own childhood being told to step aside, to wait, to take less than what was his. He had fought through each slight, each dismissal, each door slammed shut, and he had built Brooks Global to prove not just his worth, but the worth of every child who would come after him. And now, his own son, on a flight operated by a company he partly funded, was being dragged through the same indignity. His voice broke the silence of the boardroom. "Excuse me," he said, standing. "This meeting is adjourned." The directors exchanged looks, startled. Gregory Shaw, CEO of Aerovista Airlines and Nathaniel's longtime partner, had been scheduled to join the meeting later that day. But Nathaniel knew he couldn't wait. He stepped into the hallway, phone in hand. He dialed one number, no hesitation, no explanation. When the line clicked, his voice was low, firm, measured. "This is Brooks, Flight 672, ground it, no raised volume, no theatrics, just a command, precise and irrevocable." On the other end, the executive understood instantly. No one questioned Nathaniel Brooks when he spoke like that. Nathaniel ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and stood there for a long moment. His reflection stared back at him from the glass wall, a man in his early 50s, graying at the temples, tailored suit crisp, but eyes shadowed by memory. Inside, he was fighting the pull of two identities. One, the father who wanted to storm through the sky himself, to hold his son and wipe away the sting of that slap. The other, the CEO who knew this was bigger than his boy. This was about every child told they didn't belong, every passenger pushed to the back because someone else thought they were unworthy of the front. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. Then he whispered, so low only he could hear, "Not again. Not this time." At that very moment, 30,000 feet above. Isaiah sat in seat 34B, his phone dark in his pocket, his cheek still tender. He didn't know what his father would do, but he knew his father, and that was enough. Back on the ground, Nathaniel walked back into the boardroom. His executives remained frozen, unsure if the meeting was over or suspended. He gathered his notes with deliberate calm. "Reschedule," he said to his assistant. "Nothing moves until this is resolved." The assistant nodded quickly, scribbling into a planner. One of the directors, braver than the rest, asked cautiously, "Mr. Brooks, is everything all right?" Nathaniel's gaze swept across the table. The weight in his eyes silenced the room. "Everything," he said quietly, "will be set right." He left the boardroom without another word. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one measured, steady, inside him, though. The storm raged louder than jet engines. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling that dinner service would soon begin. Most passengers had settled back, headphones on, glasses of wine in hand. Yet the air still carried that faint static tension left over from what had already happened. Isaiah sat at the back, his book closed on his lap, his gaze fixed on the tiny oval window where only darkness stretched across the sky. He could hear the hum of voices, but not their words. He could feel the presence of silence more than sound. At the front of the plane, Captain Ethan Rowe adjusted his headset as the radio crackled. He had been with Aerovista for 22 years, and in that time he had faced turbulence, mechanical failures, even an engine fire over the Rockies. But he had never heard an instruction like this one. The voice from ground control was flat, precise, and unmistakable. "Captain, Flight 672 is to remain on the runway. Immediate hold. No departure until further notice." Ethan frowned, glancing at his co-pilot. "We're already in the air." "That can't be," the message repeated, sharper this time. "Captain Rowe, this is Aerovista Command. Disengage autopilot. You are ordered to divert and hold at nearest airstrip. Repeat ground immediately." His co-pilot blinked. Ground in the middle of climb. Ethan's instincts told him this was no ordinary diversion. He keyed the mic, command, confirm reason for emergency hold. The reply was short, clipped, directive issued by Chairman Brooks. Ethan sat back, stunned. The chairman, Nathaniel Brooks. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough when the man who practically owned the airline spoke. Orders weren't debated. They were obeyed. He turned to his co-pilot, who looked equally rattled. "Get us back down," Ethan said firmly. "We're not going anywhere tonight." The engines throttled down. The nose of the plane lowered. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred, confusion rippling like wind across tall grass. A woman pressed her call button. A man unbuckled, peering down the aisle. Whispered questions traveled row to row. "Why are we turning back? What's going on?" Isaiah felt it first. The subtle shift in pressure, the downward glide. His stomach tightened, not in fear, but in recognition. His father had moved. He didn't know how, but he knew. Claire, standing in the galley with a tray of glasses, steadied herself as the plane banked. She tapped her earpiece, listening as the intercom buzzed. A knot of unease grew in her chest. Diversions were rare, and when they happened, they usually came with announcements. But the captain said nothing yet. The silence itself was ominous. After a few tense minutes, Ethan's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received instructions from ground command to return to the runway. This is not a mechanical issue. Please remain calm and seated. We'll update you shortly." The cabin erupted in murmurs. People exchanged worried glances. A young mother clutched her toddler tighter. The businessman in row 1 looked around, agitated, muttering, "This is ridiculous." Claire hurried forward, trying to project calm authority, though her own pulse thundered in her ears. She knocked lightly on the cockpit door, then slipped inside when it opened. "Captain, what's going on?" she demanded. Ethan met her eyes, his face impassive but grim. "Orders from the top. We're grounded." Claire frowned. Grounded? Why, he didn't answer at first. He adjusted a switch, spoke briefly into the mic, then leaned back. "Because of you," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "What do you mean the chairman himself called this in?" "Nathaniel Brooks." "Ring a bell." The name hit her like turbulence. She swallowed hard. The boy. Her voice faltered. "That boy in 2A." Ethan's silence was confirmation enough. Her stomach dropped. She thought of the slap, the defiance in his eyes, the 9-word text she didn't know he had sent. She remembered the sting in her own hand, the heat in her cheeks when she'd shoved him to the back. At the time, she'd told herself it was discipline. But now the plane itself was frozen in place because of him. "Captain," she whispered, her voice thin. "What happens now?" Ethan's gaze was steady. "Now, Ms. Hensley, you answer for it. Back in the cabin." Isaiah sat straighter, watching the subtle movements of people around him. His book was still unopened, but his mind was alive with possibilities. He imagined his father in some high office, speaking no more than a sentence and shifting the course of an entire aircraft. He didn't feel pride in that power. He felt the weight of it. Passengers fidgeted, restless. Someone joked nervously about delays. Someone else grumbled about missed connections. But underneath, everyone could feel it. This was not weather or mechanics or scheduling. This was something deeper, heavier, more human. Claire emerged from the cockpit at last, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't return to her usual patrol of the aisle. She simply stood near the curtain, staring down the length of the cabin, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the rear, where Isaiah sat quietly. She tried to tell herself it wasn't true, that maybe there had been a mistake. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe this was just coincidence. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. The seatbelt sign blinked back on as the plane descended. The captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated until further instructions." The businessman in row 1 cursed under his breath. A college student in row 18 pulled out her phone, typing furiously. Amelia Cross, the independent journalist seated in row 10, lifted her camera discreetly, capturing the shift in atmosphere. She didn't know the whole story yet, but she could feel history tightening its grip on this flight. As the wheels touched down and the plane slowed to a crawl along the runway, Isaiah closed his eyes. He could almost hear his father's voice, not in his ear, but in his blood. Calm, steady, unyielding. This is not the end. This is the beginning. The engines whirred low. The plane rolled to a stop, motionless on the tarmac. For the first time in years, Claire felt powerless in the cabin she thought she commanded. And Isaiah, sitting in 34B, knew something extraordinary had just shifted. The plane rolled slowly toward the terminal, its wheels crunching softly against the tarmac. The lights of the airport glowed outside the windows, but instead of guiding the aircraft smoothly into its designated gate, the ground crew halted it short, far from the boarding bridge. The engines wound down, leaving only a low hum that seemed to vibrate against the silence inside. Passengers leaned into the aisles, peering through the windows. Whispers rose again, speculation filling the air. A teenager muttered, "Why aren't we moving?" while an older man grumbled about missed meetings. The atmosphere had shifted from confusion to unease. Everyone could sense something extraordinary was happening, but no one knew quite what. In the rear, Isaiah sat still, his book untouched on his lap. He wasn't anxious about the delay. He was waiting. His father's 9 words had already shifted the course of the flight. Whatever came next was only the unfolding of what Nathaniel Brooks had set in motion. Captain Ethan Rowe stood at the front of the cabin, speaking quietly with the lead flight attendant, a younger woman named Riley Tran, who had only been with Aerovista for 3 years. Her brow furrowed as she listened, nodding with a kind of nervous urgency. Claire lingered nearby, arms crossed tightly, her nails digging into her skin. Riley whispered, "So we're really not opening the doors?" Ethan shook his head. "Ground command's orders. No one leaves until clearance comes directly from the chairman's representatives." Claire's breath hitched. "Representatives?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Yes," Ethan said, turning his gaze to her. "A team is already on their way." Claire felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to protest, to insist this was an overreaction, but the captain's eyes made it clear this wasn't negotiable. Minutes stretched. Outside, vans with tinted windows pulled up near the halted plane. A convoy of security personnel in dark suits disembarked, their movements calm, coordinated, purposeful. Passengers pressed to the windows, murmuring louder now, phones slipping from pockets, ready to record. Isaiah saw the shadows of the men moving outside, and a faint sense of relief settled in his chest. His father wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of actions. Isaiah had grown up watching him resolve disputes with a quiet power that always ended in change. Now, that same power had reached into the sky to pull his son back to safety. The intercom clicked, the captain's voice steady but unusually solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to directives from Ground Command..." We are holding position. Representatives will be boarding shortly. Please remain seated." A ripple of gasps and chatter followed. Amelia Cross. The journalist in row 10 quietly switched her camera to record, her eyes sharp. She sensed a story unfolding that was bigger than a flight delay. The forward door opened at last, and two men stepped inside. The first, tall and composed, wore a dark suit with a Brooks Global insignia pin gleaming against his lapel. The second carried a tablet, already syncing data from ground control. "Captain Rowe?" the taller man asked. "Yes, I'm Robert Miles, counsel to Chairman Brooks. This aircraft is now under direct review. Please prepare the crew for debrief." Gasps filled the cabin. Passengers looked at one another, wide-eyed. Claire stiffened, her stomach turning to ice. She tried to keep her posture firm, but sweat prickled at the back of her neck. Robert Miles's gaze swept across the cabin, then settled briefly on Isaiah at the rear. His expression softened almost imperceptibly before returning to business-like neutrality. He turned back to the captain. "We'll start with the passenger report." Ethan nodded gravely. "Understood." Claire's lips parted. "Excuse me," she blurted, stepping forward. This can't be about what happened earlier." That boy was Robert's eyes snapped to her, and the cold precision in them made her words shrivel in her throat. "Ms. Hensley," he said calmly, "I would advise you to remain silent until spoken to." Passengers inhaled sharply at the rebuke. Some exchanged satisfied glances, their earlier silence now cracking into recognition of justice unfolding before them. At the back, Isaiah lowered his gaze, his heartbeat steady. He wasn't enjoying her humiliation, he wasn't vengeful, but he felt, for the first time since the slap, that truth was no longer his burden alone to carry. Robert turned to Amelia Cross. You're a journalist." Her eyes widened. "Yes, independent press. You saw what happened." She lifted her chin. "I did, and I recorded some of it." Claire's face drained of color. What she hissed? Amelia's voice didn't waver. "I record everything. It's what I do." Robert gave a single nod. "Good. That will be part of the review." Murmurs swept the cabin. Some passengers now sat taller, emboldened by the shift of power in the air. Others looked away, ashamed of their earlier silence. The businessman in row 1 who had smirked before now fiddled nervously with his tie, avoiding Isaiah's eyes. Robert addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight was diverted not for mechanical failure, but for a failure of conduct. Chairman Brooks has issued direct orders for a full investigation. Until that is complete, this aircraft will not depart." Claire's knees wobbled. She wanted to protest, to explain herself, but the weight of every gaze in the cabin pressed against her chest. For the first time, she realized she was no longer the authority here. She was the accused. Isaiah inhaled slowly, watching the scene unfold with quiet clarity. He thought of his father's words. "Dignity is not in how loud you speak, but in how long you hold your ground." He hadn't spoken much on this flight, but now the ground was holding for him. The plane remained still on the runway, a suspended world caught between air and earth, justice and silence. The doors hadn't opened to free the passengers, but they had opened to something else, truth pressing into the cabin like fresh air, undeniable and sharp. And as the night deepened outside, Isaiah knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond seat 2A or row 34. The cabin no longer buzzed with idle chatter. It throbbed with something rawer, heavier, like a courtroom where everyone suddenly realized they had been summoned as witnesses. The plane sat motionless on the tarmac, the windows revealing only streaks of airport lights and the stillness of a night that refused to move forward. Robert Miles stood tall at the front, tablet in hand, his presence commanding without theatrics. Behind him, two members of the Brooks Global investigative team quietly recorded passenger statements, moving row by row. Each whisper, each detail became part of a record that would outlive this night. Isaiah remained at the back, shoulders squared though his body was tired. He hadn't spoken yet. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than words, the kind of silence that drew truth out of others. It started with Riley Tran, the young attendant. She stepped forward from the galley, voice trembling but resolute. I saw it, she said, glancing quickly at Robert before her gaze darted to Claire. I didn't step in. I should have, but I saw her hit him. The words sliced the air. Several passengers gasped softly, though they had already known. Still, hearing it spoken aloud changed the shape of the moment. Claire flinched, her arms crossing tighter, as if she could fold herself into invisibility. Robert gave Riley a single nod. Your honesty will be noted. The businessman in row 1 cleared his throat, his face, once smug, now flushed. Look, he said stiffly, I didn't think it was my place, but yes, I saw it too. She slapped the boy. I didn't speak because I thought it wasn't my business. His voice cracked slightly, but I was wrong. His wife, who had sat stiff beside him, finally spoke as well. It was shocking, she admitted, her tone brittle. I thought he'd done something to deserve it, but he hadn't. He was just sitting there. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. Then Amelia Cross rose from her seat, camera in hand. She didn't need to say much, her recording, captured with steady hands, spoke louder than testimony. She lifted her phone so Robert could see the paused frame of Claire's raised hand, frozen mid-air. The sound of the slap was etched into the footage. Undeniable. I'll provide the full file, Amelia said. This isn't just for me. This is for the record. Robert accepted her device with care. Nodding once, his voice carried weight as he turned back to the cabin. The truth has a way of surfacing, whether spoken or recorded. Tonight, you've all seen it. This is not about one boy in one seat. This is about what kind of culture we allow to grow inside these walls of steel. Isaiah felt the air shift. For the first time since the slap, he felt less alone. Each voice was a stone thrown into the silence, breaking it apart, reshaping it into something else. Claire's voice finally erupted, sharp and desperate. You don't understand, she cried. I was doing my job. He challenged me. He sat there like he owned the place, like the rules didn't apply to him. I had to assert control. Her words spilled out too quickly, brittle and frantic. This wasn't about race. It was about respect, about order. Isaiah stood slowly, his book still clutched in his hand. The cabin hushed. All eyes turned to him as he stepped into the aisle, his face calm, though his cheek still bore the faint shadow of her hand. I didn't challenge you, Isaiah said quietly. His voice was soft, but it carried across the cabin with clarity. I showed you my boarding pass 3 times. I answered every question, and I stayed in my seat. Claire shook her head, eyes wide. Your attitude, Isaiah cut her off gently, his tone unwavering. My attitude was silence. He turned slightly, scanning the passengers, and you all saw what she did with my silence. The cabin seemed to lean toward him, listening. Even Robert's usually impassive face softened at the boy's steady composure. Isaiah drew a breath. My father told me once that dignity isn't in how loud you are. It's in how long you hold your ground. Tonight, I held mine, and she struck me for it. His words rippled through the air, pulling quiet nods from strangers who had once looked away. Claire's lips trembled. I didn't mean to. Robert's voice cut in, firm. Intent does not erase impact. Ms. Hensley, the moment your hand rose, you crossed a line no uniform can excuse. For the first time, Claire's shoulders sagged. The authority she had wielded like armor melted away, leaving only a figure trembling in its absence. Isaiah sat back down, calm once more. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vengeful. He felt tired, but also steadier, as if the weight on his chest had lifted an inch. Robert glanced at his tablet, then addressed the cabin again. This aircraft will remain where it is until further instruction. Representatives from the Department of Transportation and Aerovista headquarters are en route. This case will not be buried. His voice lowered slightly, almost reverent. Justice will not be delayed. Passengers exchanged glances, their unease now replaced by something else: respect, maybe even solidarity. The silence that had once condemned Isaiah now sheltered him. At the rear, Isaiah opened his book at last, his fingers tracing the lines without really reading. It wasn't about the words on the page. It was about reclaiming what was his, the right to sit, to exist, to belong without question. Claire sat in the galley, her hands shaking. She stared at the floor, at the shoes she had polished so carefully that morning, at the uniform she had once thought shielded her. The whispers around her no longer sounded like background noise. They sounded like judgment, and worse, they sounded like truth. Outside, the vans remained by the runway. The airport lights glowed steady. The night was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And Isaiah, for the first time in hours, let himself breathe fully. His father had moved mountains with one call. The voices of strangers had broken the silence, and now justice had begun its descent. The sound of heavy footsteps on the jet bridge carried into the cabin before the door opened. A hush fell across the passengers as if every soul on board knew that the weight of the night had just shifted. Then the door swung wide, and Nathaniel Brooks stepped inside. He was taller than most expected, broad-shouldered in his tailored navy suit, his expression carved from stone. The silver at his temples caught the cabin lights, and his presence drew every eye. This was not simply a man. This was a force that had pulled a plane from the sky with a single phone call. For a brief moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engines cooling. Even the babies who had been fussing earlier quieted as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Robert Miles stepped forward. Mr. Brooks. Nathaniel gave a single nod, then scanned the cabin. His eyes found his son in the rear, Isaiah sitting tall, though his hands clutched his book tightly, as if it were an anchor. Their gazes met, and though no words passed between them, Isaiah felt the steady ground of his father's presence beneath him. Nathaniel moved down the aisle, his steps slow, deliberate. Passengers shifted back in their seats, some bowing their heads slightly as if acknowledging authority they had no part in but could not deny. He reached the galley where Claire sat rigid, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. She rose abruptly, her words spilling out in a rush. "Mr. Brooks, sir, I didn't mean for things to..." Nathaniel raised a hand, not in anger, but in command. The gesture silenced her instantly. He turned slightly to Robert. "Have the statements been recorded?" "Yes, sir," Robert said. "Passenger and crew testimonies, video evidence, corroborations, it's all logged." Nathaniel nodded once, then his gaze fell on Claire. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of judgment. "You struck my son." Claire's lips trembled. I lost control. It was a mistake. You thought he didn't belong." Nathaniel interrupted softly, his tone sharper than any shout. "That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And tonight, you chose to treat a child with less dignity than you would grant a stranger's luggage." A ripple of discomfort moved through the passengers. The truth, spoken so plainly, had a sting none could ignore. Claire's shoulders collapsed inward. "I was doing my job." "No," Nathaniel said, his eyes narrowing. "Your job was to keep people safe, to serve them with fairness. You turned that uniform into a weapon, and for that you will answer not to me, but to the law, and to the company you've disgraced." Her knees seemed to weaken, and she sank back into her seat. Nathaniel turned away from her, his eyes sweeping the cabin once more before landing on Isaiah. He walked slowly to the back, each step echoing in the silent space. When he reached his son, he placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. The boy straightened, and the world seemed to exhale. "You did well," Nathaniel said quietly, only for Isaiah's ears. "You held your ground." Isaiah's voice was low but steady. I stayed silent. Nathaniel's hand tightened gently. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. For the first time that night, Isaiah allowed himself a small breath of relief. His father was here. He wasn't alone anymore. Nathaniel stood and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your patience tonight. What happened here is not just about one boy or one crew member. It is about the culture we allow in the skies we all share. My son's dignity was violated. That cannot be undone. But what can be done and will be done is ensuring that no child, no passenger, no human being endures this again." His voice resonated, measured and powerful. People nodded unconsciously, drawn into the current of his words. Some even clapped softly, restrained by the gravity of the moment. Nathaniel looked toward Captain Rowe. "This aircraft will remain grounded until Aero Vista executives arrive. This will not be handled quietly or behind closed doors. Every witness here matters. Every voice will be heard." The captain gave a firm nod. "Understood, sir." Robert Miles moved to confer with the investigative team, but Nathaniel remained with his son, his presence both shield and anchor. Passengers began murmuring, this time not with unease but with a sense of something larger. They were no longer bystanders to an inconvenience. They were participants in a moment that would ripple far beyond the runway. Amelia Cross, camera still in hand, leaned slightly toward Nathaniel. "Sir, if I may, this story will reach the world." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then, with a faint nod, he said, "Then let it. Let the world see what dignity denied looks like and what justice demanded can become." Her throat tightened as she lowered her camera, realizing she wasn't just recording a scandal, she was witnessing a chapter of change. Isaiah sat silently through it all, his cheek still tender, but his spirit steadier than when the slap landed. His father's presence, the voices of strangers, the truth pulled into the light, each piece wove into something larger than pain, something closer to healing. Claire sat alone in the galley, her world unraveling. She wanted to beg again, to insist she wasn't what they said she was. But every replay in her mind of the moment she struck him, every glance from passengers who once trusted her, left no room for denial. The night pressed on, the runway lights glowed steady outside, and inside the cabin, power had shifted away from prejudice, away from silence, and towards something unshakable. For Isaiah, it was the night he learned that dignity, once defended, can never truly be taken away. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet after Nathaniel's arrival. Passengers no longer whispered in confusion. They whispered with awareness, with the realization that this was no ordinary delay. Every second stretched long, every breath filled with the weight of justice waiting to land. Nathaniel remained standing at the rear beside Isaiah, his presence like a pillar that made the cramped rows feel less suffocating. He didn't pace, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, watching, waiting, as if the silence itself were a stage he had prepared. Then Robert Miles cleared his throat and addressed the passengers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, while we await Aero Vista executives, Chairman Brooks has asked that we hold an internal review now. We will hear from those most directly involved. This is not yet a courtroom, but the truth begins here." The words made the cabin pulse with tension. A hearing here, above the tarmac, inside a metal tube that hours earlier had simply promised travel. Now it was something closer to a tribunal. Captain Rowe moved into the aisle, his voice calm but firm. "I'll oversee the order. Everyone will be given respect. We will begin with the complainant." All eyes turned to Isaiah. He shifted slightly in his seat, his book still clutched in his hands, then rose. His movements were slow, deliberate. Though only 15, his composure carried more gravity than many grown men in the room. He stood facing the aisle, his voice steady, though soft. "I was sitting in 2A. It was my seat. I showed my boarding pass when asked. 3 times. I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. But she..." His eyes flickered toward Claire, then back to the passengers. "She slapped me, and then she sent me to the back." The words were plain. They carried no dramatics, no embellishment. Yet their simplicity made them ring with power. A murmur rippled through the cabin, one of shame, one of recognition. Robert nodded once. "Thank you." "Isaiah, please sit." Isaiah returned to his seat, his father's hand brushing his shoulder briefly as he did. Nathaniel's gaze didn't leave the boy. Pride and sorrow mingled in his eyes. "Now," Robert continued, "we will hear from Ms. Hensley." Claire rose slowly, her hands trembling. The authority she once wielded in the cabin had evaporated. Now, every step she took down the aisle felt like a stumble toward judgment. She faced the passengers, but her eyes darted from face to face, never landing long. "I made a mistake," she began, her voice quivering. "I was under pressure, and I thought he didn't belong where he was. I shouldn't have hit him. It was wrong." Her words spilled out too quickly, lacking the gravity Isaiah's had carried. She clutched her hands together tightly, as if squeezing the excuses back into her palms. "I've worked for this airline for years. I've kept people safe. I lost my temper. I let frustration guide me, but I'm not." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not a bad person." Her voice cracked on the last words. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence pressed down heavy. Then Robert's voice cut through. "Intent does not erase impact. You struck a passenger who had done nothing but comply. You escalated silence into violence. That is more than a mistake. It is a betrayal of trust." Claire's shoulders folded inward. She sat quickly, her face pale, lips trembling as though she might break into sobs but refused to let them fall. Robert looked toward the passengers. Those who wished to speak stepped forward now. The businessman from row 1 rose reluctantly, tugging at his tie. His voice was rough, uneasy. "I didn't say anything earlier. I watched, and I told myself it wasn't my problem. But it was. I was a coward. And I need to say, for the record, he didn't do a damn thing wrong." His wife followed, her tone softer but firm. "I thought he was out of place at first. I judged him before I knew a thing about him. And when she hit him, I stayed silent. That silence was part of the problem. I regret it." The murmurs around the cabin deepened, one by one. Voices joined small admissions, quiet acknowledgments of what they had seen and failed to confront. A middle-aged woman in row 20 admitted she had whispered a prejudice under her breath. A college student in row 18 confessed she had recorded part of the scene but didn't know whether to share it. Each voice layered onto the others, creating not just a record of events, but a confession of complicity. Amelia Cross finally rose, her camera in her hand. "I've been documenting human rights abuses for years," she said, "but I've never seen something like this, happening so brazenly in first class, in front of dozens of witnesses. My recording will go public, not because I want views, but because truth must not live only in this cabin. It belongs to the world." Her declaration sent another ripple through the passengers. Some nodded, some looked down, but none disagreed. Robert finally turned back to Nathaniel. "Mr. Brooks, would you like to make a statement before we close this hearing?" Nathaniel stepped into the aisle, his presence immediately commanding the room. He looked not at Claire, not at the passengers, but directly at his son. "This is my son," he said, his voice even but heavy with feeling. "He carries my name, he carries my blood, and tonight he carried himself with more dignity than most adults I know." He paused, then turned his gaze across the cabin. "But this is not just about Isaiah. This is about what we allow in our spaces. Every one of you saw, many of you stayed silent. That silence is not neutral. It is permission. It tells the aggressor that they are right, and the victim that they are alone. And that silence must end tonight." His words landed like stones dropped in water, rippling outward, striking hearts. Nathaniel's tone softened slightly. "We are all guilty at times of looking away. But justice begins when we stop. Justice begins when we speak. My son was struck tonight, but let this cabin be remembered not for that slap, but for what came after. For the moment people found their voices. There was no applause, not yet. The silence that followed was too sacred. It wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence of reckoning." Captain Rowe cleared his throat. "This hearing is concluded. Executives are on their way. Until then, no one disembarks." Passengers slowly sank back into their seats, their faces reflective, subdued. Claire remained hunched in the galley, her uniform now feeling more like a costume stripped of meaning. Riley Tran, the young attendant, leaned against the wall, tears streaking her cheeks quietly, not from fear, but from the release of truth finally spoken aloud. Isaiah sat down again, his father's hand resting gently on his shoulder. He opened his book, not to read, but to steady himself. The sting of the slap still lingered, but it no longer defined the night. The truth had spoken louder. Outside, the vans still waited, the airport lights still glowed, but inside the plane, something fundamental had shifted. A hearing had taken place in the sky, and its echoes would not stop at the runway. The night outside was deep now, the glow of runway lights casting long reflections across the fuselage. Inside the cabin, silence lingered after the impromptu hearing. It wasn't the silence of denial anymore, it was the silence of anticipation. Everyone sensed the final act approaching, the moment when all the waiting would collapse into decision. The forward door opened again. This time, the men and women who stepped in weren't investigators but executives, Aerovista's chief operating officer, Margaret Sloan, followed by Gregory Shaw, the airline's CEO, and a team of senior staff. Their expressions were tight, their pace brisk. They weren't here to delay, they were here to face judgment, too. Nathaniel Brooks remained at the rear, his hand still on Isaiah's shoulder. When the executives entered, he didn't move toward them. They came to him. That detail wasn't lost on the passengers' power flowed toward the man who had forced this flight to the ground. Margaret's voice was clipped, professional. "Mr. Brooks, we came as soon as we received your call." Nathaniel inclined his head, his face calm but unreadable. The call was the easy part. The hard part is what you'll do now. Robert Miles stepped forward, handing Margaret the tablet filled with testimonies and Amelia Cross's recording. The executives scanned quickly, their faces tightening with each line, each frame. When the sound of the slap played through the footage, a visible shudder passed through Margaret. Gregory Shaw, who had once prided himself on smooth diplomacy, looked stricken. This is indefensible," he muttered. His gaze flicked toward Claire, who sat rigid in the galley, eyes red, uniform disheveled. Margaret straightened, her tone firm. "Effective immediately. Ms. Hensley, you are relieved of duty. Security will escort you from this aircraft. Your employment with Aerovista is terminated." The words struck the cabin like thunder. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet approval, others simply staring, as if watching history take shape in real time. Claire let out a small gasp, her hands trembling in her lap. "Please, I've given 20 years to this company," Gregory cut her off, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "And in one night, you destroyed the trust those 20 years were meant to uphold. That uniform is not a weapon. You used it as one." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but no one moved to comfort her. For the first time, she was isolated in the very cabin she once commanded. Robert Miles spoke next, his voice steady. "This case will not end with termination. A formal complaint will be filed with the Department of Transportation. Criminal charges for assault on a minor are being considered. This is not only a company matter, it is a matter of law." Gasps echoed again, sharper this time. Claire's face went white. She covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head in disbelief. Nathaniel finally spoke, his tone even, almost quiet. "Justice is not revenge. What matters is that truth is recognized and the system changes. My son doesn't need to see you destroyed. He needs to see you held accountable." Isaiah looked at his father, absorbing the weight of those words. Accountability, not destruction, dignity, not vengeance. Margaret turned to Nathaniel, her voice more measured now. "Mr. Brooks, I cannot undo what happened, but I can commit this company to change. We will launch an independent review of all training, reporting, and bias policies. We will establish a passenger dignity protocol, something your son's courage tonight has shown us we need." Nathaniel regarded her for a long moment, his silence pressing her to continue. "We'd like you, Mr. Brooks," Margaret added carefully, "to serve as an advisor in shaping these reforms, not because of your position, but because of what this moment represents." The passengers stirred, murmuring. Isaiah felt every gaze turned toward his father. Nathaniel stood tall, his hand still resting lightly on his son's shoulder. "I will consider it," he said at last. "But understand, this reform cannot be a shield for reputation. It must be a foundation for dignity. If you want my involvement, you must be willing to tear down every excuse, every cover-up, every silence that allowed tonight to happen." His words hung in the air, sharp and unshakable. Margaret nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We are willing." Gregory cleared his throat, visibly humbled. "Then tonight is the beginning. Arrow Vista will not bury this. We will own it." It was Amelia Cross who spoke next, her camera still in hand. The world will know, regardless, but the difference will be whether they see a company hiding or a company transforming. Nathaniel inclined his head toward her, almost in thanks. At the front, Captain Rowe's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared to return to the gate. Once we dock, security and press will be waiting. Please remain seated until instructed." The engines whirred back to life, and the plane began to roll again. This time, the movement didn't feel like confusion. It felt like purpose. Passengers leaned back, reflective. Some wiped at their eyes discreetly. Others reached for their phones, already composing messages to loved ones about what they had witnessed. For once, the chatter wasn't about inconvenience. It was about meaning. Claire remained hunched in the galley, tears streaking her face, her future unraveling with each turn of the wheels. She wasn't the victim here. She knew that now. She was the lesson. Isaiah sat quietly, his book still unopened. He didn't need it anymore. He looked out the window, watching the ground lights flicker closer. His cheek still bore the faint outline of the slap, but he no longer felt the sting. What he felt was weight, the weight of knowing his silence, his restraint, had sparked something larger than himself. Nathaniel leaned slightly toward him. "You'll remember tonight for the rest of your life," he said softly. Isaiah nodded. "I already know I will." The plane reached the gate at last. The jet bridge extended slowly, connecting steel to steel, moment to moment. Through the window, flashing lights of police vehicles and news vans glowed. The world was waiting. The captain's voice returned. "Remain seated until instructed. Security will escort individuals first." Margaret signaled, and 2 uniformed officers boarded. They approached Claire, their presence calm but firm. She rose shakily, tears in her eyes, and allowed them to lead her down the aisle. Passengers watched in silence as she was taken away, a sobering reminder of the cost of one moment of prejudice left unchecked. When she was gone, Nathaniel stood once more, facing the cabin. His voice was low, but every ear strained to hear. "Remember this night. Not for the slap, not for the delay, but for what silence can do both to harm and to heal. You chose to speak. That is what turned pain into justice. There was no applause, no cheer, only a profound quiet, the kind that follows truth spoken without ornament. The door opened, the night air rushed in, the world outside was waiting, but the people inside this cabin knew they had already lived something that would echo long beyond the runway. And, at the heart of it all, Isaiah sat steady, knowing he had carried his ground and that dignity, once defended, could ripple further than any plane could fly. The jet bridge door opened fully, and with it came the flood of noise from the terminal cameras clicking, reporters shouting questions, flashes bursting like fireworks. What had been a sealed world of whispers and confessions was now thrust into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Security officers guided Claire Hensley out first. Her once pressed uniform looked wilted, her face pale and streaked with tears. The flashbulbs swallowed her as if the world itself were determined to preserve her shame. Reporters called her name, but she kept her head low, her voice lost in the storm. Passengers watched from their seats, stunned at the sudden transformation. Only minutes earlier, she had carried the posture of authority. Now she was a symbol unraveling before the eyes of millions. Behind her, Aero Vista executives moved with calculated restraint. Margaret Sloan and Gregory Shaw paused briefly at the jet bridge, answering reporters in clipped phrases. Yes, an incident occurred. Yes, an investigation is underway. No, the passenger will not be silenced. Their words were careful, rehearsed, but their faces betrayed urgency. This wasn't simply about a flight anymore. This was about survival. The airline's survival in the court of public opinion. Inside the cabin, passengers remained seated as instructed, but nearly every phone was lifted, screens glowing as people texted, posted, or streamed live. The story was no longer confined to metal walls. It was out in the world, multiplying in real time. Hashtags had already begun to trend: your flight 772, dignity in the sky, justice for Isaiah. Isaiah himself sat still at the back, his book resting on his lap. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him, some sympathetic, some curious, some reverent. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He just wanted to sit in his seat. Yet he understood, even at 15, that sometimes history does not ask permission. It arrives uninvited, and it demands you carry it. Nathaniel Brooks stood beside him, his expression unchanged, steady as ever. But inside, his chest tightened as he watched the circus outside grow louder. He had expected accountability. He had demanded it. What he hadn't fully prepared for was the storm of publicity now wrapping itself around his son. Robert Miles leaned close to him. "Sir, media control is slipping. If we want to set the narrative, you may need to speak now." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not yet. Let the noise rise first. Then we will speak into the silence that follows." Captain Rowe's voice returned over the intercom, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, you may begin to disembark row by row. Please remain orderly. Security is present to assist." Passengers began to gather their belongings, yet instead of the usual rush for the door, there was a strange hesitancy. Many glanced toward Isaiah as they passed, some offering small nods, others quiet words. "Stay strong. We're with you. I'm sorry for what we didn't do sooner." Each voice carried weight, small threads in a larger fabric of acknowledgement. Amelia Cross lingered, her camera lowered now. She approached Isaiah carefully. "You don't know me," she said gently, "but you should know your face is already on every screen out there. people are watching, and they're listening." Isaiah looked at her, his eyes steady though weary. "Then I hope they hear the right part of the story." Amelia smiled faintly, as if surprised by his maturity. "That depends on how it's told. But you've already spoken more powerfully than most grown men I've interviewed." She stepped away, following the flow of passengers out. Her camera now pointed at the executives answering questions in the terminal. The cabin emptied slowly, leaving only crew, investigators, and the Brooks family. Riley Tran, the young attendant who had testified, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you for making this visible. People like me, we see things every day, but we don't always feel safe speaking." Nathaniel regarded her for a moment, then placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Courage is contagious," he said softly. "You chose truth. Don't forget that." Riley's eyes glistened, and she nodded quickly before retreating. When the cabin was nearly empty, Margaret Sloane returned, her expression taut. "Mr. Brooks, the press is demanding a statement. If you don't speak, they'll twist this however they want." Nathaniel's gaze flicked toward Isaiah, then back to her, then let them wait. Margaret hesitated. "With respect, sir, waiting may cost the company dearly." Nathaniel's voice sharpened slightly, "and speaking too soon may cost something greater dignity. This isn't about the company's stock price. It's about a culture that allowed this to happen. We will not rush truth for convenience." Margaret fell silent, chastened. At last, Nathaniel gestured for Isaiah to stand. Together, they walked down the aisle, their steps unhurried, their presence commanding. The jet bridge glowed with camera flashes, the roar of questions swelling as the reporters saw them emerge. "Mr. Brooks, what happened tonight, Isaiah? How do you feel after being assaulted? Will you sue Arrow Vista?" "Is this about race?" The flood of voices crashed over them. Nathaniel raised one hand slightly, not in dismissal but in calm command. The noise faltered, like waves drawn back before the tide. Into that pause, he spoke. "My son boarded this flight with a ticket he earned. He sat in a seat that was his, and for that only that he was struck. That is the truth." His voice was steady, resonant, cutting through the chaos like a blade through cloth. He turned slightly, resting his hand on Isaiah's shoulder, but my son did not raise his voice, he did not lash out, he held his ground, and in his silence he spoke more loudly than anyone else tonight. That, too, is the truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed in, microphones leaned forward. "This is not only about one crew member," Nathaniel continued. "This is about a system, a culture, that must change. Arrow Vista has pledged reform, but let me be clear, change will not come from promises alone. It will come from accountability, from transparency, from dignity becoming the first-class seat every passenger deserves." Applause broke out not from the press, but from the passengers who had gathered just beyond the cordon, waiting to reclaim their luggage. They clapped softly, hesitantly at first, then more firmly until the sound rose above the cameras. Isaiah stood silently beside his father, the flashes burning into his eyes. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he simply stood, carrying the weight of the night with the quiet strength that had begun it all. Nathaniel ended with one final sentence. "Tonight is not the end of a flight. It is the beginning of a reckoning." The noise returned instantly. Questions flying again, cameras flashing, but the words had been spoken, and they would outlast the storm. As father and son walked together toward the terminal, Isaiah whispered low, "Meant only for Nathaniel. I didn't want to be seen like this." Nathaniel leaned closer, his tone gentle. "You weren't seen as weak, Isaiah. You were seen as strong enough to carry the silence. And sometimes that strength is what changes the world." Isaiah absorbed the words, the truth of them settling slowly. Outside, the lights were blinding, the noise relentless, but inside, he felt a steadiness, the quiet ground of dignity beneath his feet. The hotel suite in downtown Manhattan was quiet except for the muffled hum of traffic 30 floors below. Nathaniel Brooks stood by the window, his jacket draped over a chair, the skyline stretching before him like a constellation of restless lights. He had faced boardrooms, governments, and hostile takeovers, but tonight carried a different kind of weight, a personal one that pressed against his chest even in the silence. Isaiah sat on the couch, his book unopened once more, staring at the cover without really seeing it. The television across the room was muted, but headlines flashed continuously. Billionaire's son assaulted on flight, Aerovista crisis deepens, new era of accountability in air travel clips from Amelia Cross's recording replayed in loops. The soundless images capturing that single slap, the chaos that followed, and Nathaniel's calm command. For a long time, neither father nor son spoke. The night had been filled with too many voices already, too much noise. Yet silence had a way of carrying its own questions. Isaiah broke it first, his voice small but steady. "Dad, why me?" Nathaniel turned from the window, his expression softening. "What do you mean? Why did it have to happen to me?" Isaiah's eyes stayed on the book in his hands. "I was just sitting there. I didn't do anything. I didn't even talk back. And still..." His voice trailed off, but his hand brushed the faint mark on his cheek. Nathaniel crossed the room slowly and sat beside him. "It happened to you because sometimes the world sees what it wants to see, not what is true. To her, you weren't a boy with a book. You were a target for her prejudice. That's not your fault, that's her blindness." Isaiah frowned. "But it feels like it's mine. Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm supposed to stand for something now, like I'm not just me anymore." Nathaniel exhaled deeply, leaning back. He remembered his own teenage years, the crushing expectation to prove himself twice over, to stand not only for his name but for an entire community. He had wanted freedom, not a pedestal. "You're right," Nathaniel said softly. "You didn't ask to be a symbol, but sometimes life hands us a moment we didn't choose. The choice we do have is how we carry it, with bitterness or with dignity." Isaiah finally looked up, his eyes searching his father's. "Is that why you didn't yell tonight? Why you didn't lose it?" Nathaniel smiled faintly, though it was a tired smile. "I wanted to. Believe me. When I saw your message, every part of me wanted to tear the sky apart. But then I remembered I wasn't just your father. I was also the man others were watching. If I lost myself, they'd say the story was about my anger. I wanted the story to be about your dignity." Isaiah's gaze softened, though confusion lingered. "It still hurts," he admitted quietly. Nathaniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's supposed to. Pain is how we know what must change. If you didn't hurt, you'd never understand why this fight matters. for a while. The two sat in silence again. The glow of the television cast in muted light across the room. Then came a knock at the door. Robert Miles entered, his tie loosened, fatigue visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Press won't stop calling," he said bluntly. "Networks want exclusive interviews. Civil rights groups are drafting statements. The airline's stock dropped 12% in after-hours trading, and Washington is already sniffing around for hearings." Nathaniel rubbed his temples. "So the noise grows louder." Robert nodded. "Yes. But here's the thing, we can shape this. Nathaniel, if you step forward tomorrow with Isaiah, if you set the tone, this won't just be a scandal, it'll be a turning point." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, shrinking into the couch. "I don't want to stand in front of cameras." Nathaniel glanced at him, then back at Robert. "And he won't unless he chooses to. I won't push him onto a stage he's not ready for." Robert hesitated, then sighed. "Fair enough, but be ready. The world won't wait long." When he left, the room settled into silence again. Nathaniel leaned back, exhaustion pulling at him. Isaiah's eyes drifted back to the skyline, the glittering towers like watchful eyes. After a while, Isaiah asked quietly, "Dad, when you were my age, did this kind of thing happen to you?" Nathaniel chuckled without humor. "More times than I can count. I was stopped in stores, questioned in libraries, pulled aside in airports. Always the same question in their eyes. Do you belong here?" Isaiah frowned. "What did you do? I learned to hold myself still, to let their doubt crash against me and fall away. I knew who I was, even when they didn't. That's what kept me moving." Isaiah absorbed the words, silent for a long time. Then he whispered, "I'm not sure I can do that." Nathaniel turned toward him, his voice gentle but firm. "You already did. Tonight, you didn't shout, you didn't break, you stood your ground without moving an inch. That's harder than anything else." Isaiah blinked, his eyes moist. He didn't cry, but the heaviness in his chest seemed to ease slightly. The clock ticked past midnight. Nathaniel urged Isaiah to rest, but the boy shook his head. "I won't sleep, not yet." So they stayed up, father and son, sitting together in the quiet glow of the city. Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to Isaiah, as though sharing in the simplest ritual of strength. Finally, Isaiah asked the question that had sat unspoken all night. "Do you think people will change, or will they just forget when the headlines fade?" Nathaniel looked out at the skyline, the question hanging heavy between them. "Change never comes from headlines," he said slowly. "It comes from people who refuse to forget after the cameras turn away. Our job is to remind them, over and over, until the forgetting is impossible." Isaiah considered that, nodding faintly. He didn't like the answer, but he understood it. By 2, exhaustion finally pulled at him, and he drifted to sleep on the couch, his book resting loosely in his hands. Nathaniel draped a blanket over him, watching his son breathe, the faint mark on his cheek still visible. He felt a swell of pride and sorrow all at once, the pride of seeing Isaiah endure with dignity, the sorrow of knowing he never should have had to. Nathaniel returned to the window, staring out at the restless city. His reflection met his eyes of father, a CEO, a man bound by the weight of legacy. He whispered into the glass, his voice low but steady. "This will not fade, not this time." Behind him, Isaiah stirred slightly in his sleep, murmuring words too soft to hear. Nathaniel listened anyway, as though the sound itself was a promise of tomorrow. The night stretched on, long and heavy, but within it flickered a quiet determination. The world might be watching, but in this room, in this moment, it was simply a father and his son holding the weight of what was and what could be. The sun rose pale and golden over Manhattan, casting its first light across the glass towers, inside the hotel suite. Isaiah stirred awake on the couch, the blanket sliding from his shoulders. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then the faint sting on his cheek and the muted television flashing his own face brought it back. The night, the slap, the cabin, the storm of cameras, it was all still here. Nathaniel was already awake, sitting at the dining table with a notebook open, lines of handwriting filling the page. He looked up as Isaiah rubbed his eyes. "Morning," Nathaniel said softly. Isaiah sat up slowly, the weight of fatigue still pulling at him. "Morning." He hesitated, then asked. "Did you sleep enough?" Nathaniel replied, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed him. He closed the notebook and gestured toward the small breakfast tray the hotel staff had delivered. "Eat something. We've got a long day." Isaiah glanced at the television again. The muted news feed showed images of Aero Vista's headquarters, protesters already gathering outside with handmade signs. "Dignity for all, justice takes flight. We stand with Isaiah." He shook his head, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I can face all that." Nathaniel leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "You don't have to face the world all at once. Just face the next step. One step at a time, that's all any of us can do." A knock at the door interrupted them. Robert Miles entered, carrying a folder stuffed with papers and his phone buzzing constantly. He wasted no time. "The Senate Transportation Committee is drafting a hearing. Civil rights groups want to meet you. Every major network is fighting for an interview, and Aero Vista's board is in emergency session right now." Nathaniel listened silently. Isaiah pushed his plate away, appetite gone. Robert placed the folder on the table. "We can shape this, Nathaniel. We can turn it into policy, reform, something lasting. But you need to speak today. If you don't, someone else will fill the silence." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably. "Do I have to speak too?" Robert hesitated, but Nathaniel cut in gently. "Only if you choose to. You're not responsible for carrying the world's weight, son. But if you decide to, your voice will mean more than mine ever could." Isaiah looked down, conflicted. "I'm just a kid. You're my son," Nathaniel said softly. "And last night, you showed more strength than most grown men. That's what people saw. Not weakness, strength." The conversation was interrupted by the sudden buzz of Robert's phone. He glanced at the screen, then grimaced. "It's Margaret Sloan. She says Aero Vista's board wants to meet you in person today. They're begging. Nathaniel. They're afraid of collapse." Nathaniel considered this quietly, then let them be afraid. Fear is the beginning of wisdom. Hours later, father and son walked into Aero Vista's gleaming glass headquarters, where protesters lined the street, chanting and holding signs. Cameras flashed as they entered. But this time, Isaiah held his head a little higher, bolstered by his father's steady hand on his shoulder. Inside, the boardroom was tense. Executives sat stiffly, papers and laptops scattered across the polished table. Margaret Sloan stood at the head, her expression a mix of determination and desperation. Gregory Shaw looked visibly aged, his usual polish stripped away. "Mr. Brooks," Margaret began, "thank you for coming. We want to say again how deeply sorry we are for what happened to your son. Claire Hensley is no longer employed here. We are cooperating fully with investigators. But we know that isn't enough." Nathaniel's eyes swept the room, calm and piercing. "You're right, it isn't," Margaret continued quickly. "We're prepared to implement reforms immediately. Mandatory bias training, new passenger dignity protocols, independent oversight for complaints." Nathaniel held up a hand. "Words, promises. I've heard them all before. What matters is enforcement and accountability. Who will oversee this oversight? Who will measure the results?" The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret swallowed. "That's why we're asking for your guidance, for you to lead this change with us." Isaiah sat quietly beside his father, listening. He could see the weight in the room, the fear of reputation, the scramble for survival. But he also saw something else, the chance for something bigger than punishment. Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice low but commanding. "If I take this role, understand this, I'm not here to protect your brand. I'm here to dismantle the culture that led to my son being struck for daring to sit where he belonged. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Change is never comfortable." Gregory Shaw finally spoke, his voice strained. "And if we agree to this, what do you ask of us first?" Nathaniel's eyes flicked briefly to Isaiah before answering. "First, transparency. Every complaint of discrimination made in the last 10 years, release them. Let the truth come into the light. Only then can reform begin." Gasps rippled around the table. One board member muttered, "That could ruin us, or it could save you." Nathaniel countered, "But hiding will destroy you faster than the truth ever could." The room fell silent. Margaret finally nodded, her shoulders sinking as though under the weight of inevitability. "Then transparency it will be." As the meeting ended, Isaiah followed his father out into the corridor. His mind raced with everything he had heard. "Dad, do you really think they'll change?" Nathaniel looked down at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "They already have. Fear has opened the door. Now we make sure hope walks through it." That evening, back at the hotel, Isaiah sat at the desk, pen in hand, staring at a blank page. After a long pause, he began to write. He didn't know yet if he would share it with the world, but the words flowed anyway. "I didn't ask to be a symbol. I just wanted to sit in my seat. But if my silence helped others find their voice, then maybe it was worth it. I don't want revenge. I want respect. I want dignity for me, for everyone. If last night proved anything, it's that change begins when even one person refuses to move from the truth." Nathaniel watched quietly from the window, pride swelling in his chest. His son was finding his voice not in shouting, but in writing, in reflection. That was its own kind of strength. As night fell again over the city, father and son sat together, no cameras, no crowd, just two voices, two hearts, carrying the weight of what had been and the hope of what could be. This story reminds us that dignity is not negotiable. A slap on a boy's face became more than an act of violence. It became a mirror reflecting the silent biases and complicity that often live in everyday spaces. For older generations, this is a powerful reminder we have seen decades of change, but we know too well how easily silence can let injustice survive. Nathaniel Brooks chose calm over rage, justice over revenge. His son Isaiah chose silence over shouting, dignity over despair. And together, they showed the world that strength is not always loud, it is steady, grounded, unshakable. The lesson for us is simple yet profound when faced with prejudice. We always have a choice, to look away or to speak, to forget or to remember. Change does not come only from laws or policies. It comes from ordinary people who decide not to let silence be permission anymore. As we reflect on this story, let it guide us in our own lives. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Stand firm in moments that matter. And remember, justice begins when we refuse to move from the truth. Thank you for spending your time with us and sharing in this powerful story. Your support means everything. If this touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so together we can keep bringing stories that inspire change and remind us of the dignity we all deserve.